Archives discovered beneath the old St. Martin Parish courthouse in 1998 contained something that shouldn't have existed. Baptismal records from 7 plantations along Bayou Teche, documenting over 200 enslaved people carrying surnames reserved for Louisiana's wealthiest white Creole families. The Dupré, the Beaumonts, the Desnoyers. Names that opened doors in New Orleans society. Names that commanded respect in Baton Rouge. Names that sat in the state legislature. But these names appeared in ink-stained ledgers next to the word slave, next to auction prices, next to descriptions of physical characteristics. When these records reached the Louisiana Historical Society, 3 prominent families immediately filed injunctions to seal them. Their lawyers claimed privacy concerns, historical inaccuracies, clerical errors from illiterate record keepers. But the genealogists who'd seen those pages before they disappeared knew the truth was far more disturbing than a simple mistake. They'd found evidence of a secret that Louisiana's plantation aristocracy had buried for generations. Before we continue with the story of what those records revealed, if you're fascinated by hidden histories that challenge everything we thought we knew about the past, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. And I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your state or city in the comments below. These stories connect us across time and place, and knowing where you are makes this community even stronger. Now, let's uncover what happened along Bayou Teche. What those genealogists discovered would eventually connect 3 families, 5 plantations, and a conspiracy of silence that had lasted almost 200 years. St. Martin Parish in the 1840s existed in a world of its own making. The bayou country of Louisiana was different from the cotton kingdoms of Mississippi or the tobacco estates of Virginia. Here, the old French and Spanish colonial systems had left their mark in ways that made the social structure more complex, more nuanced, and infinitely more fragile than outsiders understood. The Acadian settlers, the French Creoles, the Spanish merchants, the free people of color who owned property and businesses all created a society with layers that didn't exist elsewhere in the South. Bayou Teche wound through the parish like a dark ribbon, its waters reflecting cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, its banks lined with sugar plantations that made fortunes during harvest season. The air hung thick with moisture 9 months of the year, carrying the sweet smell of sugarcane during grinding season and the earthier scent of the swamp during summer. This was a place where French was spoken as often as English, where Catholic feast days dictated the rhythm of life as much as planting seasons, where old colonial laws sometimes still held more weight than the newer American statutes. The Desnoyer plantation sat on a particularly prosperous stretch of bayou, 3,000 acres of prime sugarcane land that produced enough hogsheads each season to keep the family in their New Orleans townhouse through the social season. Émile Desnoyers had inherited the property from his father, who'd received it through his mother's family line, connecting back to the original French land grants. Émile considered himself a modern planter, educated at the College of New Orleans, well-traveled, a subscriber to agricultural journals from as far as Cuba and Brazil. He kept meticulous records, believed in the latest innovations in sugar processing, and prided himself on running an efficient, profitable operation. His nearest neighbors were the Beaumont family to the north and the Dupré family to the south. All 3 families moved in the same social circles in New Orleans. Their wives served on the same charity boards. Their children attended the same private academies. During the summer months, when fever season made the bayou country dangerous, these families retreated to their city homes and attended the same dinner parties, the same theater performances, the same requiem masses at the St. Louis Cathedral. But in St. Martin Parish, in the records kept in plantation offices and parish courthouses, something strange was happening. Something that none of these families ever discussed, even among themselves. On the Desnoyers plantation, there lived an enslaved man named Jean-Baptiste Desnoyers. He'd been born on the property in 1814, the son of Marie Desnoyers, who'd been born there in 1789. On the Beaumont plantation, records showed an entire family, Pierre Beaumont, his wife Catherine, and their 5 children, all enslaved, all carrying the Beaumont name through 3 generations. The Dupré plantation had even more. 12 people across 2 family lines, all documented as slaves, all bearing the surname Dupré in the baptismal records kept by the parish priest. Father Rousseau, who served Saint Martin de Tours Church, kept these records faithfully. He baptized enslaved infants with their full names, recorded marriages, noted deaths. He never questioned the surnames, never asked why enslaved people carried the names of the families who claimed to own them. Perhaps he assumed these were the results of informal marriages between planters and enslaved women, a common enough occurrence, though rarely acknowledged in polite society. Perhaps he thought it was merely local custom, or perhaps he knew exactly what those names meant and chose to keep his silence. The enslaved community knew. They understood the meaning behind those surnames, passed them down with careful intention, taught their children the significance of carrying names that made the white families uncomfortable. On Sunday afternoons, when enslaved people from different plantations gathered during their rare free time, the Desnoyers would find the Beaumonts, the Duprés would seek out the Landrys and the Thibodeaux, other plantation families whose names appeared both in the big houses and in the quarters. In the Desnoyers family quarters, Jean-Baptiste lived with his wife Marguerite and their 3 children. He worked as the plantation's head cooper, a skilled position that kept him essential to the operation. During grinding season, every hogshead of sugar needed barrels, and Jean-Baptiste could craft them faster and better than anyone in the parish. He'd learned the trade from his father, who'd learned it from his father. The Desnoyers family, the enslaved Desnoyers, had been coopers for 3 generations, their skills passed down as carefully as their surname. Jean-Baptiste was a careful man. He moved through his work with quiet precision, never drew attention to himself, taught his sons the same caution. But he also taught them to remember. Remember the stories passed down from the old ones. Remember the names. Remember that the surname they carried meant something more than the plantation owners wanted anyone to know. Émile Desnoyers knew about Jean-Baptiste, of course. It was impossible not to know. They shared the same surname, lived on the same property, saw each other almost daily during harvest season. But Émile had perfected the art of not noticing. He would call Jean-Baptiste by his first name only, would refer to him in correspondence as the cooper or the skilled barrel maker. In the plantation ledgers, Jean-Baptiste appeared as Jean-Baptiste, cooper, with no surname listed, despite the fact that the parish church records clearly showed him as Jean-Baptiste Desnoyers. This elaborate pretense extended across all the plantation families. At social gatherings in New Orleans, if anyone mentioned the strange circumstance of enslaved people bearing French family names, the subject would be politely redirected. A curiosity of the old colonial system, someone might say. Merely the priests being overzealous in their record-keeping, another would add. The conversation would move on to safer topics. Sugar prices, the latest fashions from Paris, politics in Washington. But beneath this carefully maintained surface, something was building. The enslaved families with French surnames knew their history in ways the white families desperately wanted forgotten. They kept their own records, their own stories, passing them down through oral tradition with the kind of precision that comes from knowing such stories are dangerous to tell, but too important to lose. The disruption came from an unexpected source. On a humid morning in June 1847, a young lawyer from Massachusetts arrived in St. Martinville, the parish seat. His name was Charles Porter, and he'd been sent by an abolitionist society in Boston to investigate rumors about Louisiana's free people of color losing their freedom through fraudulent legal proceedings. Porter was 26, earnest, and dangerously naive about the complexity of Louisiana society. He'd set up temporary residence at the modest hotel in town and began his work by reviewing public records at the courthouse. This was legal. Louisiana law allowed examination of property deeds, court proceedings, and parish records. Porter spent his first week copying deed transfers, looking for evidence of free people being illegally enslaved. What he found instead was something he hadn't expected. The baptismal and marriage records showed a pattern that made no sense to his northern sensibilities. Enslaved people with surnames. Not just any surnames, but names that matched the prominent families whose plantations he'd passed on his journey from New Orleans. Porter, trained in Massachusetts law where such things didn't happen, assumed he'd found evidence of a massive fraud. He theorized that free people of color were being illegally held as slaves, their freedom papers destroyed, their status changed through corruption. He was wrong, but his mistake would set off a crisis that the plantation families had avoided for generations. Porter began interviewing the free people of color in St. Martinville, showing them the records he'd copied, asking if they knew the enslaved individuals with these surnames. The free Creole community, who understood the delicate racial and social dynamics far better than Porter ever could, grew nervous. They gave him evasive answers, suggested he might be misunderstanding the local customs, recommended he speak with the parish priest for clarification. Father Rousseau received Porter in the church rectory with polite wariness. When Porter spread his copied records on the table and began asking about the enslaved Desnoyers, Beaumonts, and Dupré, the priest's face remained carefully neutral. "Monsieur Porter, you must understand that Louisiana is not Massachusetts," Father Rousseau said in his accented English. "Our history is more complicated than you might imagine. But Father, these records show enslaved people with the same names as the families who own them. In some cases, these families have existed for 3, even 4 generations. Doesn't this indicate that these people should be free? That they're being held illegally?" Father Rousseau chose his words carefully. "The church records what is presented to us. We baptize children with the names their parents provide. We do not inquire into legal status. That is not our domain." Porter wasn't satisfied. He pressed further, asking why the church would help perpetuate such obvious injustice. Father Rousseau's expression hardened slightly. "Young man, I would suggest you are making assumptions about matters you do not fully understand. Perhaps it would be wise to conclude your business here and return to Boston." But Porter didn't leave. Instead, he began visiting the plantations, requesting to speak with the enslaved people whose names appeared in the church records. This was his crucial mistake. Plantation owners in Louisiana had broad authority over their properties, and they didn't take kindly to northern abolitionists attempting to interview their enslaved workforce. Émile Desnoyers received Porter's visiting card at his plantation office on a Thursday afternoon. The card was formal, proper, requesting an appointment to discuss certain parish records pertaining to persons on the Desnoyers property. Émile read it 3 times, his jaw tightening with each reading. Then he sent his overseer to town with urgent messages to the Beaumont and Dupré families, and to 3 other plantation owners whose names appeared in Porter's copied records. That evening, 6 plantation owners gathered in Émile's study, a room lined with ledgers and agricultural journals, smelling of tobacco and brandy. None of them sat. They stood around Émile's desk, reading Porter's card, discussing in rapid French what the young lawyer might have discovered and what needed to be done. "He thinks he's found illegally enslaved free people," Jacques Dupré said. "He doesn't understand what he's really seeing." "Then we must ensure he continues not to understand," replied François Beaumont. "We've maintained this arrangement for 50 years. We cannot allow some idealistic fool from Massachusetts to destroy what our families have carefully preserved. The arrangement, none of them wanted to say it explicitly even here, even among themselves. But they all knew what those surnames meant, why they'd allowed those names to persist in the quarters while carefully erasing them from public documentation, why the enslaved families clung to those names with such determination. Émile made the decision. "We inform the sheriff that Porter has been trespassing, attempting to incite unrest among the enslaved population. We request that he be escorted to the parish boundary and warned not to return. The records he's copied are public, but his interpretation is dangerously incorrect and potentially inflammatory. The sheriff will understand." François nodded slowly. "And the records themselves? The church records? Father Rousseau keeps those as he always has. They're internal church documents. But perhaps we suggest that future entries might be less specific about surnames, for clarity's sake." The other men agreed. They'd learned long ago that the best way to keep a secret was to hide it in plain sight, while ensuring no one looked too closely or asked the wrong questions. Sheriff LeBlanc escorted Charles Porter to the parish boundary 3 days later. The conversation was polite but firm. Porter's investigations were creating unrest. His misunderstanding of Louisiana law was potentially dangerous, and for his own safety, the sheriff emphasized this part carefully. It would be best if he continued his work elsewhere. Porter argued, threatened to write to his abolitionist society in Boston. insisted he'd found evidence of systematic legal violations. The sheriff listened patiently, then pointed to the road leading east toward Mississippi. Porter left, but not before sending a lengthy report to Boston, complete with copied parish records and his theory about illegally enslaved free people. The Abolitionist Society published portions of his report in their newspaper, though the story gained little traction among Northern readers who were already convinced that Southern slavery was fundamentally unjust. Porter's specific claims about surnames seemed like a minor detail in a system entirely predicated on injustice. In St. Martin Parish, life returned to its careful equilibrium. The plantation owners relaxed. Porter had been dealt with. His misunderstandings would fade into the background noise of abolitionist propaganda, and the particular secret of those surnames remained safely hidden beneath his incorrect interpretation. But something had shifted in the quarters. The enslaved families with French surnames now knew that their names had drawn outside attention, that someone had noticed what the plantation owners pretended not to see. Jean-Baptiste Desnoyers had heard about Porter's visit from other enslaved people who worked in town. He'd heard that Porter had been asking questions about the Desnoyers name, about baptismal records, about freedom papers. On a Sunday afternoon, when the enslaved people from neighboring plantations gathered near the bayou during their free time, Jean-Baptiste met with Pierre Beaumont and Louis Dupré. These three men, heads of their respective families, made it their business to know what was happening across the plantation district. They sat on logs beneath cypress trees, fishing poles in hand as cover for their real purpose, conversation away from white oversight. "The Boston man thought we should be free," Louis said quietly. "He thought the names meant we had freedom papers that were taken from us." Pierre shook his head. He understood nothing. The names mean something, but not what he thought. Jean-Baptiste watched his fishing line drift in the dark water. "My grandfather told me stories before he died. He said we carried these names for a reason, but he never said why we weren't to speak of it directly. Only that we must remember, we must pass the names down, and we must wait." "Wait for what?" Louis asked. He didn't say, or perhaps he didn't know himself. He'd heard it from his father, who'd heard it from his mother, back to the old times, the French times, before Louisiana was sold to the Americans. This was the mystery that lived at the heart of the enslaved families with French surnames. They knew the names were significant. They knew they were supposed to preserve them, pass them down, remember. But the reason why had been lost in the passage of years, in the careful oral tradition that sometimes lost details even as it preserved the essential core. The older generation, those who'd been born in the 1780s and 1790s, had whispered things before they died. Stories about the old colonial system, about different laws that existed before the Americans came, about promises made and then forgotten when power changed hands. But these stories were fragmentary, confused by time and trauma, mixed with the kind of hopeful thinking that oppressed people sometimes needed to survive. What Jean-Baptiste and the others didn't know, what had been deliberately obscured by the plantation families for 2 generations, was that their surnames weren't accidents of colonial record-keeping or the results of informal relationships. The names carried a legal significance that had once been recognized under French and Spanish colonial law, a significance that the plantation families had spent decades ensuring remained buried and forgotten. The years passed. Porter never returned to Louisiana, though his report occasionally resurfaced in abolitionist publications. The plantation families continued their careful pretense, erasing surnames from their private records while allowing them to persist in church documents that few people outside the parish ever examined. Life in St. Martin Parish followed its predictable rhythm of planting and harvest, of summers in New Orleans and winters on the bayou, of births and deaths and the slow accumulation of profit from sugar. But as the 1850s progressed, the political situation changed in ways that made the plantation families increasingly nervous. The question of slavery's expansion into new territories dominated national politics. The Compromise of 1850 had briefly calmed tensions, but by 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act had reignited them. Louisiana's plantation owners watched the national debates with growing unease, understanding that their entire social and economic system might be approaching a crisis point. In 1856, Something happened that would eventually force the secret of the surnames into partial light. Émile Desnoyers' eldest son, Philippe, returned from studying law in Paris. Philippe was 23, sophisticated, full of European ideas about rational governance and modern legal systems. His father had sent him to Paris partially for education, but also to make connections with French merchants who bought Louisiana sugar. Philippe had succeeded on both counts, but he'd also developed something his father hadn't anticipated, a genuine interest in legal history and colonial law. Philippe spent his first weeks back in Louisiana, reacquainting himself with the plantation, reviewing his father's records, and organizing the somewhat chaotic family archives that stretched back to the original French land grants. He worked in the plantation office, a small building separate from the main house, surrounded by ledgers and deed books and correspondence going back 70 years. On a humid afternoon in July, Philippe discovered a metal strongbox in the back of a cabinet that stored the oldest documents. The box was locked, but the key hung on a nail nearby, suggesting it had been forgotten rather than hidden. Inside, Philippe found a collection of documents from the 1780s and 1790s, written in French, dealing with colonial legal matters that seemed to predate Louisiana's transfer to the United States. Most were routine: property transfers, dowry agreements, commercial contracts. But one document dated 1791 made Philippe pause. It was a formal legal instrument called a manumission paper, granting freedom to a woman named Marie, described as mulâtresse of the Desnoyers household. The document was signed by Philippe's great-great-grandfather, Étienne Desnoyers, and countersigned by a Spanish colonial official. Spain had controlled Louisiana during that period. But this manumission paper had never been filed with the colonial authorities. Philippe knew enough about colonial law to recognize the significance of that. For a manumission to be legally valid, it had to be registered with the Spanish Cabildo in New Orleans. This one showed no evidence of ever having been filed. Instead, someone had kept it in a strongbox for 65 years. Philippe continued reading. The document stated that Marie's children, born or to be born, would inherit her free status. It recognized her existing children, two boys named in the document as Jean and Baptiste Desnoyers. Philippe calculated backward. If those children had been born before 1791, their descendants would now be in their 60s or 70s. Or they could have children, grandchildren, even great-grandchildren, all of whom should legally be free under the terms of this document. He went through the other papers in the strongbox. 3 more unregistered manumission papers, all from the 1790s, all following the same pattern. Freedom granted to women of the household, their children recognized with the family surname. The documents signed but never filed with Spanish authorities. And then, underneath these, a letter in his great-great-grandfather's handwriting. The letter was addressed to Étienne's son, Philippe's great-grandfather, and dated 1803, just after Louisiana's transfer to the United States. Philippe translated the elegant French script. "My son, you will find in this box certain documents pertaining to arrangements made under the Spanish system. These arrangements were legal under Spanish law and the Code Noir, which recognized the rights of natural children to carry their father's surname and inherit status according to certain conditions. However, the American legal system does not recognize these distinctions in the same manner. The Americans are more rigid in their categories, less accommodating of the complexities that existed under our French and Spanish governance. I have decided not to register these manumission papers with the new American authorities. The women in question understood that their children would be raised on our property, educated in useful skills, and treated with consideration according to our arrangement. Making them legally free in the American system would expose them to dangers they would not face under our protection. Free people of color in the American territories face increasing restrictions and suspicions. The children and their descendants will continue to carry our name, as is their right by blood and tradition. They will remain with our family, where they can be assured of protection and provision. This is the most practical solution. When our political situation becomes more stable, perhaps these documents can be properly filed. Until then, I trust you will maintain this arrangement as I have done." Philippe read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking slightly. He understood what he was holding, evidence that his family had deliberately chosen not to free people who should have been legally free under the manumission papers. The rationalization about protection and stability couldn't hide the fundamental fact. His great-great-grandfather had decided that keeping these people enslaved was more practical than honoring legal documents he himself had signed, and these people weren't abstractions from 70 years ago. If the genealogy was accurate, Jean-Baptiste Desnoyers, the plantation cooper, was the great-great-grandson of one of the children named in these documents. Under colonial law, under the documents in this strongbox, Jean-Baptiste should have been born free. Instead, he was enslaved, had been enslaved his entire life, along with his parents, his grandparents, and his children. Philippe sat in the plantation office as the afternoon light faded, surrounded by evidence of a systematic deception that had lasted for generations. He thought about the legal implications, the moral implications, the practical impossibilities of trying to set any of this right in 1856 Louisiana. He thought about the fact that his family's wealth, including the expensive Parisian education he'd just completed, had been built partially on the labor of people who should have been free. That evening, Philippe brought the strongbox to his father's study. Émile examined the documents with an expression that shifted from surprise to recognition to resignation. "You knew about these," Philippe said. It wasn't a question. Émile closed the strongbox carefully. "I knew there had been arrangements in the old times. My father mentioned it once, said there were complications from the French and Spanish period that were best left undisturbed. I never looked for details. It seemed wiser not to know precisely. But father, these people should be free. Under the manumission papers, under colonial law that no longer applies. Under American law, these papers were never properly filed, never legally executed, and even if we wanted to honor them now..." Émile's voice grew harder. "Do you know what would happen if we freed several enslaved families because of colonial documents from 60 years ago? Every enslaved person in Louisiana with any connection to the colonial period would demand examination of old records. Every family like ours would face claims and lawsuits. The entire legal foundation of property in this state would be called into question. So we do nothing. We allow the injustice to continue." Émile stood, walked to the window overlooking the quarters where Jean-Baptiste and his family lived. "We maintain an impossible situation because undoing it would create chaos that could destroy not just our family, but the entire social structure of the state. Your great-great-grandfather made a choice. Perhaps it was wrong, but we cannot unmake it now without consequences none of us can control." Philippe returned to France 2 months later. He told his father he wanted to complete additional studies, but both men knew he was fleeing from knowledge he couldn't reconcile with continuing to benefit from the plantation system. Émile returned the strongbox to its cabinet, locked it, and hung the key on its nail. The documents remained hidden, the surnames remained in the quarters, and the pretense of not noticing continued. If the story had ended there, the secret of the surnames might have remained buried forever, lost in the destruction of the Civil War and the chaotic Reconstruction period that followed. But secrets this significant have a way of surfacing, especially when the social structures built to contain them begin to collapse. The Civil War came to Louisiana in 1862, when Union forces captured New Orleans. St. Martin Parish remained under Confederate control for another year, but the presence of Union troops less than 100 miles away changed everything. Enslaved people across the South began escaping to Union lines, where they were treated as contraband of war and given their freedom. The plantation owners in St. Martin Parish tightened their control, increased patrols, and tried to prevent news of Union proximity from reaching the quarters. But information travels through oppressed communities with remarkable efficiency. By late 1862, everyone in the quarters knew that Union forces controlled New Orleans, that enslaved people who reached Union lines could claim freedom, and that the war might fundamentally change their status. The question was whether to risk escape attempts or wait to see how the political situation evolved. For the enslaved families with French surnames, this moment presented particular complexities. Jean-Baptiste Desnoyers was 58 years old in 1862, still working as the plantation cooper, but increasingly limited by arthritis in his hands. His oldest son, Antoine, was 32 and had taken over much of the barrel-making work. Antoine had a wife and 3 young children. Escaping to Union lines meant a dangerous journey through Confederate-controlled territory with small children, with no guarantee of what they'd find when they arrived. But staying meant accepting enslavement, even as other people were claiming their freedom. The tension created by this impossible choice affected everyone in the quarters, created arguments between those who wanted to risk escape and those who counseled patience and caution. The situation grew more complex in May 1863, when Émile Desnoyers died suddenly of a stroke. His wife had passed away 2 years earlier, which meant the plantation now belonged to his sons. Except Philippe was still in France, and his younger brother, Henri, had been killed at Shiloh the previous year. The property was technically Philippe's, but he was abroad and unreachable given the Union blockade. The plantation was managed by Émile's nephew, Victor Pichon, who had neither his uncle's caution nor his understanding of the complex history surrounding certain families in the quarters. Victor was 35, had spent most of his adult life managing a smaller plantation in Assumption Parish, and saw the Desnoyers property primarily as a business opportunity. When he reviewed the plantation records, he noticed something that had bothered him for years, but which his uncle had always dismissed when Victor raised the question. Why did some of the enslaved people in the records have surnames, particularly surnames that matched white families in the parish? Victor decided this was a paperwork error that needed correction. In July 1863, he announced that all enslaved people would henceforth be recorded in the plantation ledgers by first name only, with no surnames. For buying and selling purposes, they would be listed with descriptive identifiers rather than family names. This was actually standard practice on most plantations, but the Desnoyers property and several neighboring estates had maintained the older colonial practice of recording surnames. When Jean-Baptiste heard about this new policy, something in him broke. He'd spent his entire life carrying the Desnoyers name, had taught his children and grandchildren that the name mattered, that they must remember and preserve it. The name was all they had, the only tangible connection to a freedom that should have been theirs, even if they didn't fully understand why. To have it erased now, when freedom might actually be possible, was unbearable. Jean-Baptiste did something he'd never done before. He requested a meeting with Victor Pichon. The overseer was surprised enslaved people didn't request meetings with the plantation owner. But Victor, curious about this unusual request, agreed. They met in the plantation office, the same room where Philippe had discovered the strongbox 6 years earlier. Jean-Baptiste stood before Victor's desk, his hat in his hands, his posture carefully respectful. He was old enough to remember stories from his parents about the brutal punishments that could result from speaking out of turn. "Monsieur Pichon, I understand you're changing how names are recorded," Jean-Baptiste began carefully. "I wanted to ask if the Desnoyers name could remain for my family." "It's been our name for a long time, sir. Generations." Victor looked up from his papers, genuinely confused. "Why does it matter what's written in the ledgers? You're aware of who your family is. The records are just for administration. The name matters, sir. My grandfather's grandfather was named Desnoyers. My children are Desnoyers. It's who we are." Victor's confusion turned to irritation. "You're named what I say, you're named in my records. This conversation is presumptuous. The meeting is over." Jean-Baptiste didn't move. "Sir, with respect, there are old papers. Papers that say about the name, about our family." Victor's irritation sharpened into attention. "What papers? What are you talking about?" And Jean-Baptiste, pushed by desperation and the chaotic moment of the war, made a calculated risk. "Papers from the old times, sir. The French times. Papers that say about freedom, about the Desnoyers name belonging to certain families. My grandfather told stories. He said there were papers that proved we had the name for a reason." Victor studied the old man before him, seeing not deference anymore but something harder to categorize. "How would you know about any such papers?" "Stories passed down, sir. Just stories. But I thought, maybe you knew about them too. Maybe that's why the name stayed in the records all these years." Victor dismissed Jean-Baptiste and spent the next hour searching the plantation office. He found nothing. The strongbox was well hidden, and he didn't know to look for it. but Jean-Baptiste's words bothered him. That evening, he wrote to François Beaumont, his wife's uncle, asking if there was any historical basis for enslaved people claiming the right to carry French family surnames. François's return letter was urgent and alarmed. He requested Victor meet with him and 2 other plantation owners immediately. When Victor arrived at the Beaumont plantation 3 days later, he found himself facing 5 men who'd known his uncle Emile, men who'd spent decades managing the peculiar situation of the surnames. They explained carefully, telling Victor enough to make him understand the sensitivity without revealing the full extent of the problem. Yes, there had been complications from colonial times. Yes, certain families had been allowed to keep surnames for historical reasons. Yes, it was better to leave the arrangement alone rather than call attention to it. No, Victor should absolutely not investigate further or ask the enslaved families what stories they'd been told. But don't they realize they might have legal claims? Victor asked. If there are actual documents from colonial times, there are no documents, Jacques Dupré said firmly. There are stories, rumors, wishful thinking passed down by people who wanted to believe they deserved more than their station. We've maintained peace for decades by not challenging those stories, but also not acknowledging them. You'd be wise to do the same. Victor returned to the Desnoyer plantation unsatisfied, but warned. He didn't change the record-keeping policy, but he also didn't press the issue further. The surnames remained in the ledgers, and Jean-Baptiste returned to his work, knowing he'd taken a risk but uncertain whether it had accomplished anything. The collapse of the Confederacy came rapidly in Louisiana. In April 1863, Union forces secured control of the entire Mississippi River after the siege of Vicksburg. St. Martin Parish found itself surrounded by Union-occupied territory. Confederate authority became nominal, then non-existent. By June 1863, Union troops arrived in St. Martinville, and the enslaved people of the parish began claiming their freedom. The transition was chaotic. Some plantation owners tried to maintain control, offering wages to convince newly freed people to stay. Others simply abandoned their properties and retreated to Texas or Mexico. The freed people faced immediate questions: where to go, how to survive without the resources that enslavement had simultaneously denied and provided, how to navigate a freedom that came with no land, no money, and no infrastructure to support it. For Jean-Baptiste Desnoyer and his family, the moment came on a hot morning in June, when Union soldiers arrived at the plantation. The officer in charge, a captain from Ohio named Miller, informed Victor Pichon that all enslaved persons on the property were now free under military order. Victor could offer wages if he wanted workers to stay, but he had no authority to keep anyone against their will. Jean-Baptiste gathered his extended family that afternoon beneath the oak trees near the quarters. 3 generations of Desnoyers, Jean-Baptiste and his wife, their 5 adult children and their families, and 8 grandchildren. Also present were members of the Beaumont and Dupré families who'd come from neighboring plantations with the same questions. What now? We're free, Antoine said, Jean-Baptiste's oldest son. That's what matters. We can leave, go to New Orleans, claim land under the Union programs we've heard about. Free with what? Asked one of the Beaumont men. We've got no money, no resources. And our names? He paused, looked around at the gathered families. Our names are still their names. How are we going to use them? This was the question that had been inevitable once freedom came. The surnames that had preserved a hidden history during slavery would become a source of confusion, suspicion, and even danger in freedom. A black man named Desnoyer in Reconstruction, Louisiana, would immediately raise questions about his relationship to the white Desnoyer family. The same would apply to the Beaumonts, Dupré, and others. Jean-Baptiste spoke carefully. We keep the names. The names are ours. We earned them through generations of carrying them. Whatever the truth is about the old papers, the old laws, the names belong to us now. The white families won't like it, someone said. The white families have pretended not to notice us for 70 years, Jean-Baptiste replied. They can continue pretending, but we don't change our names to make them comfortable. This decision, replicated across multiple families in the parish, created an unusual situation. As St. Martin Parish began registering freed people during Reconstruction, the records showed dozens of black families with prominent French surnames. The white families who shared those surnames reacted with varying degrees of denial, outrage, and confusion. Some tried to force newly freed people to change their names. Others simply refused to acknowledge the existence of Black Beaumonts or Black Dupré. But the freed people maintained their names. They registered them with the Freedmen's Bureau, used them when claiming property, taught them to their children. The names were their connection to a past that slavery had tried to erase, even if the full truth of that past remained hidden in locked strongboxes and buried memories. The crisis of the surnames reached its peak in November 1863, when Philippe Desnoyers finally returned from France. He'd been unable to get back to Louisiana during the war, but once Union forces controlled New Orleans, he managed passage on a French merchant vessel. He arrived at the Plantation to find it operating under Union supervision, his cousin Victor having fled to Texas, and Jean-Baptiste Desnoyers supervising the former quarters as an unofficial leader of the freed community. Philippe and Jean-Baptiste finally met properly for the first time. They sat on the porch of the plantation office. Jean-Baptiste no longer had to stand hat in hand before a white man's desk. Philippe had brought with him the strongbox. He'd retrieved it from its hiding place, had carried it to France and back, had spent 7 years trying to decide what should be done about it. "I found these papers in 1856, Philippe said, opening the box. "They're manumission documents from the 1790s. If they'd been properly filed, your great-great-grandfather would have been free. Which means you should have been born free." Jean-Baptiste looked at the documents, at the old French script he couldn't read. "My grandfather told stories. He said there were papers, that our name meant something. I never knew if the stories were true or just hope dressed up as history. They were true. Your family should have been free for 70 years. My family prevented that by not registering these papers when Louisiana transferred to American control. We profited from your labor for generations when we had no legal right to do so." Jean-Baptiste was silent for a long moment, looking at papers that represented a stolen inheritance of freedom. Then he said, "Can they be filed now? Would they make any difference?" Philippe had consulted with lawyers in New Orleans before coming to St. Martin Parish. "The Emancipation Proclamation freed you regardless of these papers, but yes, I believe they should be filed. They're evidence of a historical wrong, and they establish your family's legal right to the Desnoyers name through blood and colonial law, not just through the tradition you've maintained. Why are you telling me this? Why give me these papers? Because it's the truth. Because my family owes your family a debt we can never fully repay. And because you preserved the names when you had every reason to give up on them. That perseverance deserves to know it was justified." Philippe filed the manumission papers with the Freedmen's Bureau and the Louisiana civil authorities. He also provided depositions about his family's decision not to honor them, about the systematic concealment that had lasted decades. The filing created a minor scandal in New Orleans legal circles. Here was a white plantation owner admitting that his family had illegally enslaved people who should have been free under colonial law. But the larger significance was soon buried under the chaos of Reconstruction. Louisiana in the 1860s and 1870s was consumed by political violence, economic collapse, and the struggle over black civil rights. The specific case of the Desnoyers manumission papers became one detail among thousands of legal complications emerging from slavery's end. What mattered to the freed families in St. Martin Parish was simpler. They had their names. They had evidence that those names represented something real, and they would continue to carry them into freedom. The freed families with French surnames scattered across Louisiana and beyond during Reconstruction. Some stayed in St. Martin Parish, working as paid laborers or sharecroppers on the same plantations where they'd been enslaved. Others moved to New Orleans, where they joined the complex community of free people of color and newly freed people trying to build lives in an urban economy. Still others migrated north or west, carrying their surnames to Chicago, St. Louis, California. Jean-Baptiste Desnoyers remained in St. Martin Parish until his death in 1868. He worked as a paid cooper. taught his grandchildren the trade, and became known in the freed community as someone who remembered the old stories, who could explain to younger generations why their surnames mattered. Before he died, he told his children and grandchildren about the strongbox, about the manumission papers that proved their great-great-great-grandfather should have been free, about the names they carried being more than just tradition. Philippe Desnoyers sold the plantation in 1867 and used part of the proceeds to establish a small fund for the freed Desnoyers families, a gesture that could never compensate for 70 years of stolen freedom, but which represented acknowledgement of the debt. He spent the rest of his life in New Orleans working in law and documenting the legal complications of the transition from French colonial law to American law to post-war Reconstruction. His writings on colonial manumission papers and the rights of natural children under French law eventually became reference material for legal historians, though few people connected his academic interest to his personal history. The white families who'd shared surnames with enslaved people reacted in various ways. Some, like the Beaumonts, simply ignored the existence of black families with the same name, maintaining a fiction that the similarity was coincidental. Others tried to force freed people to change their names, though these efforts largely failed. A few, following Philippe's example, quietly acknowledged the historical relationships and provided small assistance to the freed families, though always privately, never in ways that might threaten their social standing. As Reconstruction ended and Louisiana fell back under white democratic control, the story of the surnames faded from public consciousness. The freed families continued to carry their names, but the specific history behind them, the manumission papers, the deliberate concealment, the colonial laws, became just family stories again, passed down orally in communities that often lacked the education or resources to fully document their own histories. The documents that Philippe had filed ended up in various Louisiana archives. Some were lost in fires or floods, others were misfiled or forgotten. The families themselves scattered, moved, changed, adapted to new circumstances. The names remained, but the full context of why they mattered gradually faded. By the early 1900s, when older generations who remembered slavery died, much of the specific history was lost. Younger generations knew they carried French surnames, knew vaguely that this had something to do with old plantation families, but the details of manumission papers and colonial law were largely forgotten. The names became simply part of their identity, with the deeper history surviving only in fragments. This is why the discovery of the baptismal records in 1998 was so significant. Here was documentary evidence of the surnames spanning generations, of enslaved families maintaining French names despite every pressure to abandon them, of a hidden history that the plantation families had spent decades trying to obscure. When genealogists examined those records and cross-referenced them with other archives, they began to reconstruct what had been deliberately obscured. The systematic pattern of families bearing surnames that should have indicated free status under colonial law, but who remained enslaved because documents had never been properly filed. The legal injunctions that sealed those records were eventually overturned. The documents are now available to researchers, though they remain controversial. Descendants of the white families argue that the situation was more complex than simple injustice, that colonial law was ambiguous, that their ancestors believed they were providing protection rather than perpetrating theft. Descendants of the enslaved families point to the manumission papers, to the evidence of deliberate concealment, to the 70 years of stolen freedom. The truth, as always, is complicated, but ultimately clear. People who should have been free remained enslaved because it was economically convenient and socially easier to maintain that enslavement than to honor documents that challenged the racial and economic system. The plantation families pretended not to notice the surnames because noticing would have required acknowledging an injustice they were not willing to remedy. The families who carried those surnames through slavery and into freedom knew their names mattered, even when they didn't fully understand why. They preserved them with determination, passing them down as a form of resistance, as a connection to a past that slavery tried to erase, as a claim to identity and dignity that no system of oppression could fully destroy. Today, across Louisiana and beyond, there are black families with French Creole surnames: Desnoyers, Beaumont, Dupre, and dozens of others. Most don't know the specific history of how their ancestors acquired and maintained those names, but the names themselves remain as evidence of a complicated past, of families who preserved their identity across generations, and of a historical injustice that Louisiana's plantation aristocracy tried for decades to hide behind a careful pretense of not noticing what they absolutely knew was there.